Okay. Kia ora everyone, and welcome to the September webinar of PHONZ. And we're continuing our extended presentations, some of them from the virtual conference we had. So welcome to everyone, and especially I would welcome Len Cook, who some may remember, but he was formerly the government statistician, 92 to 2000 in New Zealand, and then was the UK National Statistician 2000-2005. Len's currently Research Associate at the University of Victoria, and he's going to talk to us on making sense of why young men are now staying out of prison. So thank you, Len, and welcome. Over to you.
Right, thank you, Barry. Can I say I got into this in part because I found that when Moana Jackson's work, looking at understanding how we actually ended up with so many Māori in prison, and then when I started getting into it, I discovered that over the last decade, the rate at which young men are in prison has declined so much that it's a lower rate than we've seen for about 70 or 80 years. So what I'm going to talk about is how in fact did that come about? What does it mean for the future, and what are some of the influences? But first, my comment is often, as you can see from this chart, that this is actually the prison population over the last 40 years. And the dotted lines are actually just the people who experience remand in those particular years. And the four grey bands, the bottom one is Māori males 25 and over. The next band up is Māori males under 25. And the next one is the darker grey is European, and then there's Pacific and Asian. And what you can see is that the number of people in prison has declined, but actually the rate of decline of Māori males 25 and over is really quite small compared to the decline in younger Māori males and the population in total. I won't talk about it other than to say, when you look at the remand population, very clearly over the last 10 years, we're also using our prisons as a place of keeping people who would otherwise be on bail in some other way. And so with the people who experienced prison in New Zealand, and either through remand or as sentenced prisoners, has increased quite significantly. If you have a view that actually just experiencing being in prison, whether you're on remand or not, has an impact on your future, and then in fact, this is something that we ought to be concerned about, but I won't go into that aspect of it much more. Just to look at the short-term trends for a start, which is what most people actually look at. Oh, sorry, this is a longer-term trend. This is me looking at the whole history of Māori males in prison in New Zealand for 100 years. I must admit, by the way, that the first 80 years I had to go down to level 0 in the Victoria University Library and haul stuff out of books, because unfortunately we're in our digitisation world, we tend to forget that we've got a lot of history. What you can see there, the red bars are males under 20. And if you look at the year 1971, you can see that had about 800. The peak year is 1983 with about 1,000. Interestingly enough, because of the population change, 1971 was the highest rate of putting young Māori men in prison. We put 8%, or 1 in 12 Māori males in 1971 under 20 were in prison, 70 to 19. If we look at 1983, when there was 1,000, that had gone down to 5%. Interesting enough, you can see that the dotted line is the age of people being in prison. The age, we concentrated so much over that period in putting young people into prison that the average age of prisoners fell to its lowest ever of 24, and it's continued to rise since. The other impression that you can get from this chart, just looking at prisons, is that the age mix of the prison population has changed significantly, particularly since the 1980s, and it's become older and older, and you can see the older ages have increasingly dominated. There's one other interesting thing that you can see is that the age group 30 to 39 in yellow, it really only started to increase about 1986. And interestingly enough, if you look at the blue group, which is 40 to 49, It really started to rise about 96. And the interesting thing about that is these are 10 years and 20 years after this peak here. I guess the central thrust of this is pointing out that while we can look at prison statistics to understand the justice system, it's a wee bit like driving a car with a rear vision mirror. You've got very little understanding of what's gone before, what's influenced it. And my central point is that actually, unless we understand Māori demographic dynamics and the huge dynamism of the Māori population and how it's changed over the last century, we don't really get a sense of what's actually happened to Māori in the prison. And that's, I guess, the central thrust of what I'm going to talk about. Just looking at the last 20 years, for example, the red line just points out that the rate per 100,000 of Māori males under 20 going into prison had an average until 2009 of about 3%, or 3,000 out of 100,000, and it's been continually declining since. The Māori males 20 to 24, the grey line, actually peaked at 4.5% in 2006, has been on a continuous decline. And these declines, you'll notice, lag a bit. So the decline in Māori males 25 to 29 has occurred, has also lagged. So this is the European rates. You can see there that European males 17 to 19, the rate of being in prison is now very, very low. The interesting thing about these figures is that if you measure disparity by the ratio of the Māori rate to the European rate, disparities have virtually not changed. So although we've seen this really significant drop-off, then the disparities haven't changed. If I look at 30 to 39-year-olds, the top line is Māori males 30 to 39, and you can see that's around 3% for the whole period, particularly from 2005. And Māori males 40 to 49, again, fairly flat at 1.5%. The interesting thing about these figures, of course, and the 25 to 29, is that these are prime parenting ages. So the effect of putting males in prison at this rate, 1 in 30 odd, is actually taking parents away from their children. And I'll talk a bit about how do we see the transfer from one generation to the next of imprisonment rates. If we look at the European rates, the 3 dotted lines, you can see that there's been some decline in males 30 to 39, and the other 2 ages a little bit less. So in short, what we're seeing is young men of all ages over the last 10 to 15 years, their chance of going into prison has reduced quite significantly, quite dramatically. Older males, for Europeans, we're seeing a decline in Māori and male imprisonment, but not at all as much for Māori. And I guess one of the lessons to learn from this is, given the huge range of initiatives we've had over the last 20 years in terms of Māori development, it's obviously, if it's had an effect, it's had its effect for young people, but why has it had no effect on older males in their imprisonment rates? What I've done here is I've actually taken the European rate of imprisonment and applied it to the Māori population at each age. So that my dotted line there, the purple dotted line, is the number of Māori that would be sentenced, serving a prison sentence, if they served a prison sentence at the same rate as the European population. So you can see that remarkably, it's lower than the European rate, a European number, which is the yellow dotted line, and the dotted line, the black dotted line, is the number of either Pacific Island or Asian or other ethnic groups that are in prison. Now, my bars are the excess, the difference between the current number of Māori in prison at each age and what the number that would be in prison if they were imprisoned at the same rate as Europeans. And what you can see there, that this excess is been about the same from 2006 right through to 2020. So although we've had quite a number of initiatives, we have reduced the number of people in prison. In fact, the excess has actually plateaued. Now, I developed the excess, those of you in health will appreciate, comes out of Florence Nightingale, who many years ago, when she made the observation that for a young man living in a British Army barracks, they had twice the chance of dying of an infection than someone in the general population. And then just to do what a government statistician would never do, she said that was the equivalent of lining up 1,009 young men on the Salisbury Plains each year and shooting them. So it was a nice dramatic way. And I think I think the excess is really important is that it actually quantifies the disparities. I suspect that for many people, discovering that the disparity between Maori and non-Maori ranges between 4 and 7, it sort of sounds like repeating the same old tune and there's anything you can do about it. But once you start saying, actually, this is 3,500 people every year is being affected by disparity. But you can also see through the red, which is under 20, you can see the mix of people affected by that disparity is itself getting older. There's a third way of looking at disparities, I should add. I was involved a little bit in some of the submissions of the Waitangi Tribunal for what was going on with the rangatamariki. And at one stage, I presented some statistics of the number of children in care and pointed out that there were 1 in 64 Maori and explained the disparity was about 8 times for European. And a couple of the old kuia, Dame Tariana Turia, and Nada Glavish popped up, and one of them said, actually, I'm not really interested in the difference between Maori and non-Maori. 1 in 64 is just wrong. It's disproportionate. And so in a way, it's a societal view of disproportionality that we often forget in our statistics, that we also need to be able to inform. You know, if 1 in 64 is wrong, then actually it won't normally be a statistician that points it out. It'll be someone who actually uses the statistics and is able to make it perhaps a more deeper judgment about society. What in order to try and understand the longer term patterns and effects, what I've done is I've taken that all of the populations every 5 years for 110 years from 1911 to 2021. And what I've done is I've looked at firstly at their age specific imprisonment rates every 5 years. And you can see in this chart, I've looked at males under 20. And up to about 1956, we put about 1% of Maori males under 20 in prison. When we get to 1966 and on to 1991, we actually put just over 5%, and the peak year of it was about 8.2%, 8.3%. That's an extraordinary excess. In fact, these you might describe are extreme policies. We did the same in childcare. The Maori, the rate at which people became state wards from the late 60s to the mid 1980s, overall, 7% of Maori males, 2% of Maori girls, and 1% of Maori boys were taken as state wards and put in the care and custody of the state. And we know from the Royal Commission on Abuse that the care and custody somewhat varied quite a lot. What we're seeing is a whole generation that was significantly affected by an extreme of the state. Now, you could also argue, and I would, that 1% of non-Maori boys going into care of the state was also extreme. And the interesting thing is, when I pointed out to you in the chart, which I've got here, of Maori male prisoners, and that 1986 showing a peak in the, showing a growth start in 30 to 39 and a growth start around 96 in 40 to 49, you see the same pattern in the non-Māori statistics as well. So that period, this period here, had an effect for that generation, that cohort, for the rest of their lives. The next generation from that were in prison at under 20 from 91 and to 2006, their rate was about 3%. And if you look at what makes these cohorts really different from the past and the future, this cohort here in 1996, 1/2 of the Māori population was under 15. We also had whānau sizes of around 6. Māori women's fertility was about 6. Non-Māori woman was about 3.4. So what we did here, if we were taking 7% in prison, you can imagine in a family of 6 that it would be very few that could escape having one in care and custody or in prison. So the small size of the population gave an additional cohort effect to what was happening to individuals. And by the way, the dotted line is the number. And you can see even here's the Māori population about 5 times larger. And we put in 5 times more when it was 1/5 the size. So you can see the impact on it. What I would argue here is that these children were those whose parents were off away in prison or not there. Their expectations, their opportunities were significantly reduced. They were still in large family sizes. The other thing about this group here, this group joined the workforce at a time when unemployment in New Zealand was really high. Between about 1986 and 2001, there were virtually there was no increase in the total number of people in employment in New Zealand. You might recall the 1990s were rather miserable for us. And in fact, in 1992, 42% of Māori males 17 to 19 were unemployed. For Māori males 20 to 24, the rate was about 26, might be 25. So this group here experienced both a background, often of solo parenting, because at this stage, nearly 40% of Māori children were being brought up in a one-parent household. With a huge taking away of males, obviously that had quite an impact. So this group here, in a way, reflected its parents' experiences. It's another interesting phenomenon. The parents of this generation here, if you look at the work that was done by I've just forgotten the guy that wrote the book on the 1918 flu epidemic, Jeffrey Rice, in his revision, he pointed out that about 5% of the Māori population died during the flu epidemic, about 7 times the rate of non-Māori, but the concentration of deaths was generally between about 20 and 40 years age, and they were mainly male. You then come to the next generation, this generation in the Māori battalion, 4.9% of Māori males who were 20 to 40 during the Second World War died in the Māori battalion. This generation here ended up going into care at a great rate, the state, and this generation here started off with a very low rate of employment. This generation has had virtually no experiences of that sort. So what we're seeing is a generation here whose life experience is a bit more like their great-grandparents than their parents. And what I'm now just going to do is show that through the other older ages of the population. As we look at Māori, this is chart 20 to 24. You can see that some of that generation is now in prison aged 20 to 24. And the numbers are starting to drop off, but it's still significantly, so that each of these years, this group this is the rate, and it expands that generation. We then see for age 20 to 25 to 29, this generation is starting to be sparser in that population. We then come to 30 to 39, and those are primarily either of that older group or this group, the group of their parents. All you'll notice consistently at a high rate of about 2.5%. And with no fall, no drop off again in 40 to 49, you can see the increase as that group reached age in 1996, that group came of age, and we start to see that. And so we've got no people that were born after 1990 that are in the prison 40 and over, just an arithmetic proposition. So therefore, what I've actually done, you can see I've created 4 artificial cohorts. It's enabled me to take period and age data and generate 4 cohorts. And these cohorts enable me to then fit a lot of other information that can help me understand what's actually going on at that time. We can relate it to the care information. We can look at education, employment, where Māori in each of these generations were in the mix of jobs that we had. How did the increased professionalisation of Māori population, when did it occur, and which groups did it affect? So those 4, now these, as you would expect, are slightly crude boundaries. They're not exacting boundaries, they're somewhat fuzzy, but they allow me to look at those 4 different groups. And this means that I can then take each of those age groups and look ahead. So in 2021, as I pointed out, there are still some people in prison who came from that 1945 to 70 birth cohort. When we get out to 2036, we're going to see fewer and fewer. We got no idea what this very light green group will be, but as you can see, the impact on the future population of that reduced period in their early life of imprisonment is going to have a major effect on who is actually going, the past experiences of the prison population at any time. So this has enabled me, as you can see, I can really only understand how extreme the period between for these 2 groups, people born after 45 and born before 1990. I can only really understand that if I can see what's gone on before 1960, and I can see that extreme shift. I can then see what's actually happening now and how that will affect the prison population. Why this is important is if we just took these rates here and assumed, I would say somewhat moronically, that they are going to continue for the next 30 years, given that the Māori population aged 30 to 50 is one of our faster growing subsets in the population, it will grow by about 25% over the next 20 years. If we assume these rates are going to stay the same, then we'll need to get back to Phil Goff's prison building experiences of the 2000 to 2005. Or if we look at this chart here, then we have a different view. And maybe, and my contribution, maybe all I'm saying is we just need to look a lot more deeply about how we think about future prison numbers. That simple moronic extrapolations based on who is actually in prison are not going to help us at all understand. This is just a little cohort analysis where, using the IDI, I've looked at every male born from 1981, and these points are the first year, the share of them who are actually the first time in prison at that particular age. So the dark line is by age 18. You can see that that's dropped off quite a bit. The next age, it's dropped off quite a bit. So actually, at this level here, we're seeing a remarkably significant decline by age 25, or in fact, most significant by age 22, that whereas we had about 11% of Māori males born in 1981 were in prison by the time they were 22, that's now gone down to 5.5%, with some stability and prospects of declining. I've got this is a little chart, another life course chart, which is actually of a study done in 1967. It was started in 1967. The Old Child Welfare Division of the Ministry of Education interviewed every boy born in New Zealand. Well, actually, it was 88%, but it was described as a census. And they followed them through until their 25th birthday. And what you can see there is that this is the incremental probability of a first appearance in a court in New Zealand. That could be the children's court, the magistrate's court. And what you can see, the Māori are grey, you can see that Māori under 17 came to the children's court at a much higher rate. We can see also that the age at which they came in was much younger. So Māori boys coming in to the children's court, the key age that they really started rising was their 13 and their 14, no, before they were 14. So 13 and 14-year-old Māori boys were coming into care at the rate of over 7%. And the peak, and so even those age 14 were coming in at a trivially marginally higher rate than those age 16. Whereas non-Māori boys, the rate increased with age. So what you ended up with in child welfare institutions was a much larger share of Māori boys who were much younger and who were in the company of a smaller number of non-Māori boys who, I don't know, Barry, whether it's a technical term in the health sector, but I would say degrees of badness. So these lads obviously had to be a bit better to get into the system. On the right-hand side, you can see the cumulative probability. And so what this says is by the time they were their 25th birthday, 46% or 47% of Māori males born in 1957 had come before a court, and 22% of non-Māori boys. Now, I'm not Māori, but I can tell you if my old mum knew that around my birth cohort, I had a 22% chance of coming before a judge by the time I was 25, she might have kept me inside for most of my life. You know, these for non-Māori or Māori, these are extreme rates. But for Māori, what you're seeing is disproportionality. One of the key influences on disproportionality, by the way, was that when a Māori kid came that was under 17 to a judge, 20% were placed in an institution, whereas for non-Māori, 10% were placed in an institution. So this study actually records some bias in the system right from the start. This, I think, helps give you a sense of how on earth we got to this. This didn't happen by accident. This happened because we had quite extreme views that actually naughty boys should be put in prison, an institution to be looked after and cared for. And of course, we built up Borstalls. This is just another chart of the time. This just shows you the number of children in state wards. We reached an extreme in 1978, went right down with the children, young persons legislation. Interestingly enough, to statistical experts like yourself, we never bothered to actually analyze what was going on in the first 10 years of our world-leading child protection legislation. I'm sure it won't surprise Barry, but 10 years. And so it's only in 2000, and even for the first 4 years, MSD feel that data is not reliable. You're probably wondering what this peak is here. This is the impact of the Kahui twins. 2 twins were murdered and who were in care in 1987. So what did the department do? It took an extra 1,000 Māori kids into care in case they might be at risk presumably for the 2008 election. And then over the following 3 years, they went back. So here, just bureaucratic risk aversion dragged another 1,000 kids into the uncertain pleasures of the care and protection of the state. The brown line is adoptions. And between this period, 45 to the early 80s, Ian Poole calculates that we took 87,000 babies off mainly unmarried girls in closed adoptions. So you can see what we were doing around this time, where the sort of, when people look at policy, evidence-based policy, this here reflects in a way a sort of a Edwardian moral view of how population should behave, which again is probably why many of our prison policies still develop. This is just the Maori population distribution, and as I pointed out, firstly, what you can see is the huge dynamics of the Maori population. This population here was about 40,000, and it grew, and you can see it grew most strongly through high fertility, but that high fertility was diluted in two ways: very low survivability of babies and very low life expectancy of older Maori. From about 1940, Maori survivability of young children increased. So by 1966, this period here, we had the largest ever increase in the Maori population, to the extent that the population of Maori children under 15 in 1966 was double that of Maori children in 1951. And I can't find anywhere in our data a time when a cohort defined by an age group increased by that much in a short period of time, in such a short period of time. The other thing which is important, when you look at our statistics on urbanisation, which is another factor in the demographic side, the share of Maori children doubled between 51 and 66, but the share living in urban New Zealand settings increased by 4. So the visibility of a young Maori population coming from rural areas or being born in urban New Zealand with an extremely white police, teaching and other services, you can imagine there'd be a modicum of tension. And then what we've seen here, of course, is life expectancy at older ages is increased as well from about the mid-70s. Barry will know more about that than me. So the Maori population, its dynamism is really quite extraordinary compared to almost any, certainly any other population in New Zealand. I haven't mentioned much about urbanisation, but Ian Poole describes this period between about 1950 and 1970 and Maori urbanisation as being the sharpest, most rapid urbanisation of a population that's been recorded anywhere in the world for a population. Just a little bit, here's some growth of different age groups, because I find this sometimes easier to present. So we're seeing, again for young Maori, over 30% increase in the, or coming up to 30% of the population will be young Maori by 2043. And again, if you look at 35 to 44, the blue age, you can see that if we simply assume that those rates continue, then we're going to be implying that we need quite a few more places in our prisons if we don't think carefully about where imprisonment rates are going. What I've done here is, some economists might balk at it, but what I've done is I've taken the dependency ratio, the ratio of both old and young, and related it to the workforce. But what I've done is I've taken the weights from a fiscal incident study that was done about 2013 by the Treasury. And so I've weighted the number of people under 17 by negative 0.6. I've weighted the number of people over 60, 65 and over by negative 2. And I've weighted the number of people who are in between 17 and 65 by plus 3. And so I end up what I call a sort of an economic contribution ratio. And what you can see is if that ratio applied in 1966, the Maori population was barely, if it were living alone was barely sustaining itself in terms of the capacity of a workforce to sustain the dependence in the population. Very quickly, by 96, in fact, it had exceeded that and was equivalent to non-Maori, and it's actually going to stay at a much higher rate over the next 20 years. So, and this is simply because the comparative youth, the higher fertility, and the still higher mortality at older ages of the Māori population. The non-Māori population never really, it started on a much higher point because, of course, we were delivering babies left, right, and centre in the 1960s. Fertility was still very high, dropped off. But then, since about 2006, we've seen this continuous decline as the baby boom generation, which is mine, age. And we now dominate the impact of transfers in New Zealand if we add in health and education, health and benefits. So I just make this point that what we're interestingly enough going to see in the Māori population, assuming that we invest well in education, is an economic potential which will be very different from what was in the memories of the old folks that have made a lot of our public policy. In fact, interestingly enough, if you go back to the Hun report, which in 1960 was a very rich statistical analysis of the Māori population, but it also contained a very strong view that this massive growth in the Māori population would actually ultimately lead to an urban proletariat. And so it never had, the Hun report never expressed any sense of opportunity out of that future, the Māori futures from its demographic change. And I think what we've seen in the last 20 years through a lot of initiatives should lead us to think a bit differently. And while the arithmetic of Hun was actually quite accidentally reliable, he overestimated fertility rates and underestimated survivability and of course the intermarriage. So I've just about finished. What I'll do, and I'll just point out what are the methodology issues. Frankly, you face huge issues with ethnic classification. And obviously to create a series from 1911 to 2021, there are points, particularly in 1986, where there are discontinuities. Prisoner measurement is an issue. We've got one measure of prisoners, which is those sentenced by the courts. We've got another measure, which from the corrections, which is those serving in prison. And as I pointed out at the start, we've now really mucked things up by having a huge share of the prison population of people simply serving on remand. I've raised the issue that we need to rethink disproportionality as being a bit more than disparity ratios. I think I just want to challenge that we could actually generate the cohorts which fit our thinking and not be specifically focused on birth cohorts. So my cohorts, 4 cohorts, are subject to obviously a lot of challenge. But you can see, and the other point is you can't do this without actually spending time with old publications, making your way through the websites of government departments, which can sometimes be more like a maze. I found a lot of fascinating data in master's theses of people who in the 80s and 90s were forced to do a lot of donkey work going through publications, and they've saved me quite a bit of work. And actually nattering to people that actually work in the field has been a huge issue. So this is what's built up to what I've got. And I don't think you can do this without almost feeling more like an anthropologist than how we normally think about statisticians. So I'll leave it there, Barry. You're on, your mic's not on, Barry.
Thanks very much, Len. Wonderful presentation, and it fits very much in the theme of what PHONZ is about, is that using data, turning it into information, but more importantly, the interpretation, which is actually the basis for decision making. So thank you very much. Are there any questions from anyone for Len? Well, one, Len, is the implications then for policy development from what your findings. What you know, if you were able to have the crystal ball, be the Prime Minister, what's the advice you give to the politicians or decision makers?
Well, I think we need to invest a bit more in understanding the drivers of people getting into prison, the demographic shifts, and also understanding each prison population. For example, if you look at the number every 5 years of people, say 40 to 49, over a 5-year period, if we're putting 1.5% of that age group in prison, the catchment might well be, say, 5%. We ought to be able to use our data to tell us over a 5-year period, what is the total number that actually experience prison of that age? Because that ratio shifts of the number that experience prison as opposed to the number that are in prison at the reference dates. It ought to give us an idea as to whether things are changing or not. So we've got a lot of information we could use more effectively. I also think that what we can see is while we're being quite remarkably successful at young men, it may well be that the people like the judiciary employ discretions differently when they're dealing with a person who comes before them with no form and is young, compared to someone who's already committed an offence and they decide what to do with them. So it may be that we don't understand how discretions are applied. And I guess the third thing is, if we're failing to keep old men from coming back to prison, do we really need to think a bit more about what happens to them? For example, 2 weeks ago, I was talking to someone in the city mission. I'd just been to chat with them in their transition house, and I saw more older males in the street sitting down in doorways than I've ever seen. Something's happened. So I asked them what had happened. Was I just dreaming? Because I wander around Wellington. And they said social welfare has just recently decided that single males will be made to leave emergency housing. Now, if you haven't got a place to put them, then the next step will be the street. Those males come out of prison. Now, since we had the Ashburton killing in social welfare, we now have uniformed people in front of every social welfare desk. I think we're creating barriers. I mean, if I'd just come out of the clink and I wanted to get my $300, I think I'd be a bit uncomfortable leaving a uniform site and being looked over innocently by someone. I think we're doing a lot of things badly, inconsistently in the rehabilitation and the return to normality of people who have been in prison.
Thanks, Len. We have a question. I think Zhang, you're there. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Your hand up? Yes.
Not a question, just a quick comment. At earlier slides, talking about the age distribution and one age group 30 to 39, and then you talk about that it could be a parent, the father in prison. But actually, for the Māori population, they tend to be younger parents. So they tend to have baby earlier. So the age 39, they could already become grandparents. So I thought this is not only just one generation, could be 2 generations each there. So I just say in the future, when we analyze the data, we need to use the Māori lens there. So that is just a small comment there. Thank you.
Yeah, I did. I mean, the 25, I usually talk about the 25 to 29, but the rate of 30 to 39 people will still be parents. Because we're talking about teenagers, and although 20 is the age of first birth, you're still seeing children, I mean, in larger families. So I think your point's quite as relevant, but I guess I'm mainly making the point that prisoners are parents. If I did a calculation of 25 and over, 25 to 40-year-olds, and in the one past period, and I think it worked out at 3.5%. Were in prison at any time. I think the transmission of the Māori fertility, that was slower. The decline was a bit slower. So that's why that second period after 1986 is still important in large family sizes.
Zhang, did you have a follow-up question?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Has anyone else got a question for Len? Like lots of presentations, Len, probably people go away with the questions You've provoked a lot of questions, and I'm sure you'd be happy to answer them even offline if anybody needs to. But Patrick, can you see anybody else with a question?
No, I think that was everybody.
Yeah.
Well, people can have the slides if they want them.
Yes.
Barry.
What we usually do is we'll put the recording and the slides up on the PHONZ website so anybody can, and also perhaps your contact details, Len, if anybody wants them.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. Well, if nobody else has got a question, once again, on behalf of, yes, we have, Sidhu from Auckland.
Oh, kia ora, hi, my name's, it's actually not Say It's My Karate Club, I'm apologising. Zoom automatically assigns me a profile depending, and I must have logged in as them. I'm Lou Wickham, I'm an air quality specialist in Auckland, and I was worried about asking my question, it might be a bit dumb, but you're a statistician, I'm very curious. There was a study or correlations done around the world with the phasing out of lead in gasoline and the consequential reductions in ambient lead in air that was linked or correlated with prison population and recidivism and crime around the world. And they've seen the correlation. I wonder if you've seen the study, and has it been disproved? Because it showed that in country after country, all around the world at different ages and really different places, that there was a significant drop after about a 10-year lag in lead being phased out of petrol and crime rates. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't. And I guess I should admit that my methodological bias is I've started with the concept of a cohort, a demographic cohort, and then added information related to those cohorts when I can, but I haven't looked at that information and seen how patterns in that have changed, because it may well have relevance to us. Possibly would it have more relevance in very highly urbanized areas? I mean, it's not something honestly I have got any competence in to address the specific question, but other than, as I say, if I found that I could look at it and see how it fitted in with those cohorts, that would be my main interest.
Okay, I might email you. I'll get your contact details after. I think you'll be very interested in it, because
No, that would be great.
And I haven't seen it disproved yet. I'm very curious. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Good. Thank you. I'm sure another avenue to explore, Len.
Yes, always something. As I say, it's like an anthropologist. Every time you pick up a stone, there's something interesting underneath it.
I suppose there is a profession called statistical anthropology.
I don't know. It might be one developing.
Well, there doesn't seem to be any other questions for you, Len, and certainly if anybody in the audience does have a question, you can send it to me, Patrick, or Len directly. The information will be on the PHONZ website. So on behalf of everyone, Len, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, and good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Len.